On the black waters off Muroran, Japan, at 3 a.m. on July 15, 1945, thousands of American sailors held their breath. They were serving aboard the mightiest ships the world had ever seen, the USS Missouri, the USS Iowa, the USS Wisconsin, and they were currently parking just 28,000 yards from the enemy's doorstep. These men had been raised on nightmares of Japanese ferocity. They knew the stories of kamikaze pilots screaming out of the sun, of submarines lurking in the deep, of soldiers who would fight to the last man rather than surrender. They expected the ocean to erupt with torpedoes. They expected the sky to turn black with zeros. But when the order came at 3:10, and the Missouri's massive 16-inch guns roared, sending shells the weight of Volkswagen Beetles hurtling toward the Japanese mainland at twice the speed of sound, the response was nothing. For 6 straight hours, the American Third Fleet poured destruction onto the Wanashi Ironworks, the steel heart of Japan's war machine. The muzzle flashes turned night into noon. The concussions rippled across the water like shockwaves from an angry god. And Japan simply watched. No planes scrambled. No coastal batteries fired. No torpedo boats sliced through the dark. It was a silence louder than any explosion. It was the sound of a superpower reduced to a spectator of its own annihilation. But this wasn't just cowardice or weakness. It was the result of a catastrophic strategic failure, a fatal flaw that had been building for 20 years. This is the story of why Japan, the nation that audaciously attacked Pearl Harbor, ended the war unable to defend its own harbors. To understand why Japan stood still while its cities burned, you have to understand the religion of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Decisive Battle Doctrine, Kantai Kessen. For decades, Japanese strategists knew they couldn't win a long war of attrition against the United States. America had more steel, more oil, and more factories. So, they devised a plan that was elegant, mathematical, and ultimately suicidal. The idea was to lure the American fleet across the Pacific, bleeding them dry with submarine ambushes and air attacks along the way. Then, somewhere near the Philippines or the Mariana Islands, the fresh and superior Japanese combined fleet would spring the trap. One massive, glorious engagement, battleship against battleship, would wipe out the U.S. Navy in a single afternoon and force a negotiated peace. This doctrine consumed them. Every yen spent on warships, every hour of officer training at the Etajima Naval Academy, was focused on this singular offensive moment. Defense was considered an afterthought, even cowardice. But there was a problem. The doctrine faced entirely outward. Japan built a navy designed to fight 2,000 miles away from home, leaving their own coastline virtually undefended. They neglected radar networks. They didn't build integrated coastal artillery. They didn't develop anti-submarine warfare tactics. Why would they need to defend the homeland if the enemy was going to be destroyed in the middle of the ocean? By July 1945, the irony was bitter. The American fleet hadn't played by the rules. They hadn't sailed blindly into the trap. They had methodically dismantled Japan's defenses island by island. The decisive battle never happened. Instead, the enemy was now parked in Japan's front yard, and the Japanese Navy had no doctrine for what to do next. As the Missouri's guns pounded Muroran, the remnants of the once feared Japanese combined fleet were actually nearby. In the great naval anchorages of Kure and Yokosuka, mighty warships sat motionless at their moorings. They weren't broken. They were thirsty. Japan had started the war to secure oil reserves in the Dutch East Indies. And for a while, they had it. But in their obsession with offensive glory, they had refused to use their destroyers to escort supply tankers, preferring to send them to hunt American warships. American submarines, realizing this mistake, slaughtered the Japanese merchant marine. By 1944, tankers were sinking faster than they could be built. By the summer of 1945, the empire was dry. The battleships that remained, like the Nagato or the Haruna, were effectively floating scrap metal. They couldn't sortie to meet the Missouri because they literally didn't have the fuel to get there and back. The resource that justified the war had become the reason they couldn't fight it. While the Japanese high command was paralyzed by logistics and dogma, the civilians on the ground were facing a new kind of apocalypse. On July 14, just a day before the Muroran strike, a task force led by the USS South Dakota, Indiana, and Massachusetts arrived off the coast of Kamaishi to target the Japan Iron Works. We often talk about the atomic bombs, or the firebombing raids, but naval bombardment was a unique psychological terror. Air raids were terrifying but brief. The bombers came, dropped their payloads, and left. Naval bombardment was continuous. It was a mechanical, rhythmic erasure of life. The 16-inch shells fired by these ships weighed 2,700 pounds. When they hit, they didn't just damage buildings, they vaporized them. At Kamaishi, the bombardment lasted 2 hours. Over 800 shells were fired. The steelworks were silenced for months, but the collateral damage was horrific. 1,471 houses were destroyed. Hundreds of civilians died instantly. Tragically, the shells didn't discriminate. Among the dead at Kamaishi were Allied prisoners of war, men who had survived years of brutal captivity only to be killed by their own countrymen's fire days before the war ended. There is another, darker reason why Japan didn't respond to these bombardments, even with the aircraft they still had. It wasn't just that they couldn't fight. In some cases, they chose not to. Japanese intelligence knew the Americans were coming. They tracked Admiral Halsey's fleet. But the High Command had made a cold-blooded calculation. They were hoarding every remaining resource, every plane, every gallon of aviation fuel, every suicide boat, for the final defense of the homeland, known as Operation Ketsugo. They believed an American amphibious invasion was imminent, and they were right. Operation Downfall was planned for November. If they wasted their dwindling planes trying to stop a battleship bombardment in July, they would have nothing left to stop the invasion barges in November. So, they let it happen. They made peace with the slaughter of their coastal cities. They watched as the American ships sat offshore, unchallenged, and decided that the lives of the civilians in Kamaishi and Muroran were a necessary sacrifice to preserve strength for the final suicide struggle. The physical damage to Japan's industry was significant, but the psychological impact was absolute. For years, the Japanese people had been told their military was invincible, that the divine wind would protect them. Now, 30,000 civilians in Hitachi fled into the hills in panic-stricken hysteria, not just because of the shells, but because of what the shells represented. The enemy could stand just off their coast, visible to the naked eye, and destroy them at will. There was no divine wind. There were no Zeros sweeping down to save them. There was only the thunder of American guns and the silence of their own defenders. This was the moment the illusion broke. The bombardment proved that the nation was defenseless. On September 2, 1945, the formal surrender of Japan was signed aboard the USS Missouri, the very same ship that had shelled Muroran weeks earlier. The guns that had hurled 2,700-pound death were now silent, their barrels cold, serving as a table for peace documents. The bombardment of Japan was the final thunderous chapter of the battleship era. Soon, missiles and jets would render these floating fortresses obsolete. But in those final days of World War II, they delivered a brutal lesson that echoes through military academies to this day. Japan's fatal flaw wasn't weakness, it was certainty. They were so certain the war would be fought on their terms, in the deep ocean, that they never prepared for the war that actually arrived at their doorstep. They built a sword but forgot the shield, and in the end, they could only watch as the world they built was dismantled, shell by shell, from the comfort of the horizon.